Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this fantastic project. Now I'm going to, well, it's the last session, I'm going to present the project for Peru. We call it Radical Policy Experiments and Inflation. This project is co-authored with Cesar Martinelli from ITAM. Well, my plan is to talk about four big things. First, a narrative of the history since 1960, and then I'm going to talk about some stylized facts regarding nominal and real stability. And then I will try to conclude, have some ideas for what is coming next. Well, first of all, we can divide the modern fiscal and monetary policy in Peru in three broad stages. The first stage goes from the 60s to 70s, all right, and is characterized by a huge fiscal expansion without the necessary increase in taxes. Actually, the state was very small, no capacity to increase further taxes, given that there was an important amount of demand for the public. And this caused an accumulation of public debt, all right? And, never seen before in recent history. And a typical Sergeant Wallace type of story started to unfold. And eventually prompted higher and higher inflation, all right? So the story of inflation in Peru starts more or less at the end of the 60s, right? Slowly increasing, first one digit, and then passing the 70s, turning to the 80s, went to two-digit inflation rates year on year, and then continue going up and up, and then well, you will see what happened. So this is the start of the story. And then comes the 80s, all right? And the 80s is characterized by unusual experiments in policy making in Peru, all right? I'll talk about these experiments in detail, clearly, but later. But one feature of these experiments, even though it was common to most of the experiments that were taking place in South America, it has some particular features, all right? One particular feature of these policy experiments was what we call debt repudiation, right? First, in a very low-profile way, the government stopped paying debts, the services of debts, and then it was in '85. It was openly announcing that it was doing so, right? This it's not trivial because it generates complexities at the time of valuing the debt and valuing the service and what's going on. Well, the fact is that the story of inflation continued increasing, right? And this is the decade when we reached levels of hyperinflation, right? And it was only stopped by a gigantic orthodox type of stabilization in August 1990, 8th of August 1990. So every Peruvian remembers that day in particular. And there are videos on YouTube with a famous message given by the finance minister, right? Well, so I'm going to talk more about these episodes. So let's start what was going on in the 60s in Peru. To start with, you have to know that in general, the Peruvian economy is a primary resource producer and exporter. It is still now a very important resource producer engaged in the production of a variety of minerals. For example, in contrast to Venezuela, which relies, or even Chile, that rely heavily on one big natural resource. In the case of Peru, there's a variety of natural resources, mostly minerals, though. All right. So, and that was a story, post-war story, like at the beginning of the 50s. The Peruvian economy was in a boom, right? And it was a boom mostly driven by the exports of natural resources. Another feature of this period, even the 50s, was that, and it was also unique, the exchange rate was floating in Peru for some time, a brief period, but it was floating. It was almost a unique experience because almost 100% of the countries that signed the Bretton Woods agreements were managing fixed exchange rates, right? Peg against the dollar, and the dollar pegged against the gold. But in the case of Peru, it was floating. Another feature of this episode was that the state was small, right? Very small, liberal, however, it was kind of captured by the elite. All right, the elite was this primary producer, exporters, and mostly foreign, actually, and with very low capacity to generate taxes. So that's what the key feature of this part. At the same time, given the growth in the middle class and the growth of the cities, all right, and the massive migration from the rural areas to the coastal part of the country, there was an increasing demand for public services, for education, and there was a necessity for a bigger government, all right, and that meant higher taxes, higher resources for the government, which was not existent at the time, all right. So there was a huge social pressure on the streets. Parallel to this, the Dependency school, that's Raúl Prebisch, right? Raúl Prebisch, the singer, were very popular in South America during those days, right? And the ideas became very powerful among politicians and intellectuals in Peru, epitomized by this institute. This is a military academy which formed the future members of the government, the military future members of the military government that will come in the 70s. All right, so the Dependency school had sensible ideas, some of them quite all right, but not others, all right? For example, there was sensible, the need for greater equality of opportunities. That meant land reforms. There was a huge. One feature of Peru was the huge difference between the coast and the rural areas. The rural areas, the Andes, where the agriculture had very low productivity. It was medieval, actually. All right, and the coastal areas where the cities were growing, where kind of the agriculture was more productive, even though there's a scarcity of water, but there was a huge difference in Peru, and land reform was one of the key reforms that were advocated by the Dependency School, along with public education. Another important feature of this school is that foreign capital is bad, all right, because it is creating enclaves in the Andes. It is not synchronizing with the locals, and not even creating linkages to startups, local industries that were starting during that period. And so they called for greater public investment and publicly owned enterprises. These ideas were espoused by a lot of people in Peru, in the elite, the political elite, and even the academics in Peru. And these ideas finally were taken by this military junta that took government in 1968. The bottom line here is that there was a massive need for resources for the government to do all this stuff, right? Resources that the government didn't have, all right? And the government didn't have the capacity to raise those resources, right? So in the 60s, the first government that came into action was the Belaunde government. Belaunde has lately had another period of government. So Belaunde was elected. It is compared with this person in the USA. I just forgot, John F. Kennedy, right? Similar messages, kind of also popular, all right? At the time, he was kind of compared with John F. Kennedy. And when he entered, of course, he took all these ideas of land reforms, the need for reforms, all right? And one of the things, I didn't talk about this, I need to mention this. The 1962 period, in that year, this National Planning Institute was created, and it will last until actually the big stabilization in Peru in the 90s. So during that period, this National Planning Institute was in action. And it was one of the fundamental instruments of fiscal dominance later on, all right? So the central bank itself had to respond to the National Planning Institute. And the creation of that institute was at the beginning of the 60s, okay? Following all these lines of the Dependency School. All right, so Belaunde tried to start the reforms, but with not enough power, all right? It was sort of weak. And in Congress, for example, they just couldn't raise taxes, all right? So it was like kind of the opposition and the game between opposition and the Belaunde administration did not reach an agreement on a tax increase, and So they postponed the tax increase, so they couldn't agree. And in 1967, given the mounting debt, the increasing debt and the increasing deficits, in 1967 we had a balance of payment crisis, and it forced the government to devalue. It was an important devaluation, 1967, right? And that devaluation prompted the coup, the military coup in 1968. All right, things were bad, all right, but the end of the regime, all right, was triggered by the balance of payment crisis, the huge devaluation that took place in September 1967, if I'm not mistaken. All right. And that devaluation alone generated inflation as well. So who took power? Took power General Velasco. Velasco was an extreme nationalist president in Peru. Later on, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela became fan of Velasco. Now he will took the ideas of Velasco and the way he did things in Venezuela. Most of the ideas came from Velasco. The big difference is that Velasco didn't have the resources that Chavez had, right? So the idea in the case of Velasco was to do the reforms that Belaunde couldn't do, right? To start, and given that he was a dictator, it was easier, and they took over the economy, actually, all right? So they started a massive program of expropriation of companies, all right? The number of publicly owned enterprises increased in this period. Many public services, or even basic firms, that provided elementary stuff were publicly owned by this time during this government. All right. Another aspect of this government is the second one. All right. The increased expenditure in military, increased military expenditure. All right. Which in the national accounts is not clear as well. All right. So we can see the overall expenditure, but we cannot see the specific numbers. But it is believed that the military expenditure went up, but by most than what official statistics say. All right. At the beginning of this period, at the beginning of the 70s, there was a sort of boom in commodity prices. So at the beginning, he was lucky. So there was no need to. There was not much effort to increase taxes. Taxes were increasing along by this windfall of higher commodity prices at the beginning, the problem was that after this brief period of commodity price increases, the continuing reduction in commodity prices was evident, as I will show later, and that created a problem because the government was ever more increasing its expenditures and not raising enough taxes, all right? And the fiscal position was deteriorating even more. No, it's a continuous stuff, continuous and continuous. It continues from the past government. So, and also in the 70s, there were dollars in the foreign markets, and they were cheap. So the government started getting more and more foreign debt, right? But there was another coup in 1975, and it was another military that took power. For two reasons. One is effectively in economic terms, the last 2 years of Velasco were not good years, or it was deteriorating much faster. And the other, which is not properly tested yet, is the fact that there was a huge probability of war with Chile, all right? And to avoid that, to avoid war, all right, it is hypothesized that Morales Bermudez took power. So those years were very hard in terms of military expenditures, not only in Peru, but also in Chile and all in Argentina. You know, all these military governments during this period. In 1879, we had a war with Chile, a war that we lost, and since then, we were getting closer to the 100 years of the war. And there were these sentiments. Peru lost territory. Yes, lost territory. And there was this sentiment in the air during those days about you know this war that we lost 100 years ago. You know, so it was, and that's why. You know, these governments were spending a lot on weapons, Russian weapons. Okay, so that's the story, and then comes this other president, Morales Bermudez, for example. He was trained. He was a military, but he was also Ministry of Finance in Velasco, right? He was Minister of Finance. So he was trained also in this high studies academy of the military that military had. What happened in this second part, 75 to 80, is basically the same story. All right. There was another balance of payment crisis in 77, I think. Yes, 77, and then there was a boom in commodity prices in 78, 79. So there was, and those booms and busts will show up in the, for example, in the fiscal accounts. They affect the fiscal accounts. And one other thing, well, so given that there was a devaluation also here, a big devaluation, and also there was a change in the way the exchange rate was managed. All right, before until this point, the exchange rate was basically fixed. All right, with eventual devaluations forced by the circumstances. Budget deficits. External shocks. Drying up of international reserves that prompted devaluations. But from this point onwards, a policy of mini devaluations, constant devaluations with a calendar even, started. And this also is associated with a higher increase in inflation. All right, I will show all these elements in graphs later on. All right. So the thing is, at the end of the 70s, we had even more inflation, and the fiscal deterioration was at the worst up to then, all right? Then comes the second government of Belaunde, all right? The one who was ousted by Velasco, came back through elections, and he started he attempted the stabilization of prices, all right? But again, he was weak, you know? So he repeated his weakness of his first government here as well, all right? He was very weak, and on top of that, he had bad luck, right? Very bad luck. We had a natural disaster in '83. Then there's the world recession prompted by U.S. Increases in interest rates. You know, it was Volcker, was it? And debt problems in all the region, right? And so things were even worse, right? And at this point, there was this sentiment among the public and economists even that, you know, orthodox attempts to stabilize don't work in Peru, all right? They're bad. IMF, the bad guys, you know. It's very popular, no? The IMF, you know, was really the bad guy. Because in the 70s, at the end of the 70s, there were, you know, IMF-based stabilization programs. All of, you know, it was mostly backed by the IMF or these programs that failed. And I will talk about more in you know, this sentiment of orthodox policies don't working is epitomized in this sort of Bible, El Perú heterodoxo. It's a book that shaped the policies that came afterwards, all right? And these policies were in sharp contrast with a conventional economic theory, all right? So this is just two sides that Cesar chose from the book. For example, the fact that fiscal deficits will not create inflation, all right? Or the fact that the same fact, right? Deficit is not inflationary, on the contrary, right? And so the plan that came, it's called the heterodox plan in July 1985. This is with Alan Garcia. You know, Alan Garcia is coming now to the picture, so the plan was just control prices, multiple exchange rate, massive credit subsidies, and this open cry limitation of debt payments, right? And the consequence is we had the worst crisis in history. At the beginning, they worked. There was also good luck, but later, you know, the distortions were magnified. All right. So then comes the stabilization program, and I will talk about at the moment about these stabilization parts. So let's take a look at the history of inflation in the graph. Here in the red one is the monthly inflation from the 60s. You can see, and then the blue one is the log of prices, right? But we can see two things. First, there are kind of these spikes. Some of these spikes or hikes in inflation are explained by sharp devaluations, all right? But the trend here, the upward trend that started in the 70s, is the increasing seigniorage and increasing money financed deficits, all right? And the graph is cut here at more or less 15%. The monthly rates went up even to 400%. So this is the same graph, but just to point out that there are two things going on here in the inflationary process, right? And you can see that the inflation is high, increasing, and getting volatile. Even volatile when inflation was low unstable, but it was volatile. And when the stabilization came, all right, inflation fell actually, and also the volatility of inflation came down, all right? So it's a drastic comparison between this stable period and this sort of stable period as well, all right? Here I just put also a graph here on the bottom part is the monthly devaluation, all right? So you can see that some of these hikes, some of these devaluations match with the hikes in inflation, right? And this is, look, this is, so all this period up to the 76 or something, the exchange rate is fixed and devalued occasionally. But here, the crawling peg starts, right? Crawling, adjusting, and then here's the massive, gigantic devaluations in Garcia's years, and then again a floating exchange rate regime. So in parallel, there's a continuous fiscal deterioration, all right? So again, inflation in the upper part and the deficit of the non-financial public sector on the bottom line here. You can see that the deficit started strongly in the 70s, up to 8%. These are unusual events. For example, this is the boom in 79 that I talked about, all right? But it was not fundamental, you know. This is the boom at the beginning of the Garcia period as well. So tax is heavily relies on commodity income, all right? And the bottom line is that the deficit was more than 8% during this whole period, more than 8%, all right? And it came down with adjustment, came down to less than 4%, and then eventually it's 2%, 1%, even negative deficits came down, all right? But the adjustment was basically this, all right? In a few quarters, the government managed to cut the deficit, all right? Reversing all the reforms, actually, you know, privatization and freeing the control of prices. Well, what happens in the big inflation period? You know, in this part that I don't graph here, all right? This time is this is annual inflation, so we can see here. Now this is monthly, actually. Okay, monthly inflation in the period of high inflation. Here, inflation is 6%, 5% or more. All right, that started in 1988, and you can see most of the monthly inflation rates are below 50%. All right, so technically they are not Kagan type inflation rates, except for this observation and except for two observations here. All right. One feature here is that this initial rise in inflation, passing the 50% reference, was even before the stabilization. All right. It was in July 1990. All right. When the president Fujimori was elected, but people got the knowledge that he was going to apply a really tough, so they started gambling for high prices, and this is this initial rise in prices. And then this huge increase is just the effective liberalization of controlled prices, you know. Oil, gasoline prices, you know, all the control prices were freed. There was a huge devaluation as well. Now, I plug the seniorage graph here as well. Now, you can see that seniorage starts increasing during the 70s, the 80s, and then comes radically downwards in just in just a few periods, all right? It's very contrasting with inflation here. We're still trying on documenting this, but we have during this episode, there was a new type of business started, the business of documenting very high frequency indicators, prices, and also the exchange rate. So actually, there's one public publication which was very used during this period, which is called Cuánto. All right, this magazine reported daily price changes, the daily price index. So what we have is that just after, the next day or the next week, prices started falling, and also the exchange rate. They overdid, the initial jump. So this is the Laffer curve. So these two observations are the 1989 and 1990. And they just went up to the other side. So this is the devaluation, the big devaluation, and then came the floating exchange rate. Well, one problem with this is that afterwards, the adjustment of prices took a long time. Contrasting the Argentinian, for example, which was really fast. All right. In this case, it took like 7 years to achieve one-digit inflation. In February 1997, we achieved one-digit inflation, and with a huge recession at the beginning of the stabilization. That was the cost. But the bad thing, the cost was that it took too long, and there was a huge recession. The good thing, apparently, was that it lasted. It lasted, and so there was no going back. All right. So just to end it, to mention the facts here. Contrasting to other stabilization episodes, there was base money growth rate, the anchor, all right? So the exchange rate was devalued once to a sufficiently high level and then led to floats, and it was very contractionary, all right? But it was very slow. The adjustment of prices to achieve low inflation rates was very slow. It took 7 years. And well, the fact that why they chose to float parties, there was nothing else to do, because there was during that time there was no reserves. There were no reserves to back fixed exchange rates. So there was the only possibility, maybe. So that is it basically. I didn't talk about the real instability, but it is associated. We had a huge stagflation, hyperstanflation we call it, during the whole period. So, but we don't know if it is because of the nominal instability or because of sheer bad luck. Because we had terms of trade falling as well. Bad shocks. We're working on that. And to conclude. I'm going to just the modeling challenges here. In the story that I've told, there are many delays in the adjustment. So it will be important to model that, and also if there was some kind of learning, even good things or bad things, and if that learning, social learning or common sense shaped policies as well. All right, so that's it.
The authors are still working on the paper, so in fact I got the slides this morning. So I thought that I would just talk about something that I think is very related to that General Velasco approach to economics, and you'll see it for the case of Venezuela. And this is something that, this was part of the first conference. Now, I'm not going to give you the full picture, but I just want to emphasize a few. Yes, a few things from there that I think are interesting, and it relates to several of the experiences that we said. Yeah, so there's lots of pictures here. Now, just in context, Venezuela, this is GDP per capita relative to the United States. Just so you have an idea that here I'm going to look 1960 to back. I didn't do the update, but this is 2005. So it's a huge decline in relative income, right? And it's interesting. So Venezuela is an oil economy. So a lot of the whole fiscal side is through the oil economy. A lot of the volatility on this economy doesn't come from changes in oil production, but it's through the transmission of through fiscal policy, and you'll see that. But in any case, what I think is interesting, I say an oil economy, is that the first oil shock happened in 1974. And a lot of people like to say that these are resource economies, natural resource costs, and so on. But if you look at this, the decline started way earlier. And also, I think it's interesting to relate to the other experiences. 1958 was the end of the dictatorship, which was in place for 10 years, 1948 to 1958. And it's kind of, so democracy started, and it's an interesting question, the decline. I think what democracy tried to do was to do lots of, very much like the Velasco, I think the Velasco regime maps very well Venezuela. You associate it with Chavez. I think Chavez is an exacerbation of that, but all these public investments, government intervention of the markets, government intervention in resource allocation started really in 1958. And so it's interesting to ask, whether that sort of resource reallocation could explain this fall. So just for context, this is a period in which kind of relative income is falling, or at least the U.S. Kind of productivity is not keeping up pace with the U.S. The other thing that is important, in I think not just for Venezuela but for all the countries that we've seen, is that volatility is much higher than what you typically see in developed economies. And you see that this is very much the case in Venezuela in terms of, and I'm going to make this emphasis, that kind of looking at before 1974 and after. And this is why I think the connection with the fiscal transmission is important for Venezuela, is that prior to 1974, kind of the standard deviation of the trended GDP was about 2%, which is it's higher than US, but now if you look at after kind of 74, 2005 is 5.4%. So huge swings. And so when we look at these economies, or we look at Argentina, many other economies, you see these booms in GDP, and you see a lot of commentators that talk about how well the economy is doing, but those are very non-lasting. So the trends on all these economies is really negative. And so how does the oil transmit to the economy? Primarily through, all revenues are all taxed away. So nationalization of the oil industry happened in 1976, although the discussions of nationalization started with democracy in 1958. It was already perceived, so if I go back here, this huge increase in wealth in Venezuela. So oil was discovered about 1914. Foreign multinationals did the investment, and Venezuela at that time was very open. So these multinationals brought the know-how, and towns were created, roads, the huge expansion. But discussions of nationalization really started around the 1958, even though the industry was nationalized in 1976. Okay. So there are taxes, and as you can see, a lot of the government revenue comes from oil. Now, what's important is for me to highlight the kind of the difference between 1974 and after, is that there was a change in the level in terms of the total revenue, but kind of the volatility of that revenue. The same you can see it on the graph for the expenditures. There's a change in the level, but if you compare kind of the fluctuations of that expenditure before and after 74, it's really dramatic. And the same applies to the deficit. Now, I'm going to emphasize that the ultimately, when I do the accounting, the kind of deficit that's seen as the central government deficit is not going to be the critical part. A lot of what happens, similar to Bolivia and other experiences we've seen, is that what's off the book, the public enterprises, other type of expenditure programs. Now, where the debt, for Venezuela, you couldn't do a full decomposition given the data limitations, but I should say that basically the central government guarantees debt from these public enterprises, which include the aluminum company, the energy company, the subway company. And so the government kind of backs that debt. And so you cannot do a huge decomposition, but essentially a lot of the debt in Venezuela is external. Different episodes, some domestic agents may buy that debt, but it's denominated abroad and is sold abroad. And these are long-term debt, very, very little short-term debt. These are mostly maturities of 10 years. And what's interesting, and I guess Nancy was talking yesterday about the sources of why governments borrow. Here is dramatic to see how really the periods in which the government borrow more are the periods in which there were oil booms. So this period after 1974 is really the period where there was a lot of borrowing together with this increase in revenues from oil. And perhaps one explanation is that the expectation is that these projects will turn up and be repaid, but as you will see, that was not the case. Now here the debt is, I can't go through all the details, but this, for the most part, the fixed exchange rate regime until 1970, until 1983. And then it has been through different ones. So in some periods, there's an official rate and a market rate. And here I'm valuing the debt at the official rate because that's how they contabilize the interest payments. But obviously, this would be much more dramatic, this rise in debt, if you put it at the market exchange rates. And you can see debt rising with rising reserves, rising exports. Venezuela hasn't had hyperinflation, periods of as dramatic as in other countries, and in some way, 80, the highest peaks were 80, 89. Most of that was repressed inflation, adjustment in prices. And then in 94, there was a financial crisis. Those are the periods that you could see that things could have broken loose, but somehow redemption came. All prices went up in some of these periods, and in fact, Chavez government started in 1999, and there was this, decade prior to him, oil prices averaged $9 per barrel. Chavez on to today, average 65. Now it's interesting that I guess an update of this will include the latest period, which I think is looking like redemption may not come in the sense that the debt has gone through the roof. The Chinese have already been lending to the government in future oil because they realize that they may not get repaid otherwise. And will prices increase to 150? It's not obvious. Venezuela had from 89 to 92 a government of market reforms that, in some sense, was a period that there was an adjustment program that, to some extent, was successful, but it didn't last very long. So the first military coup that Chavez attempted was in 1992, and so for political reasons, things were abandoned, and then the whole thing collapsed. But so from 94 to 99, then you have these transition governments that happen after the coups that essentially generated a financial crisis. Many things were abandoned. But 89, 92 was a period in which prices were, prior to that, prices were controlled. Pretty much all the prices for everything were controlled, and then they were lifted. And there was an adjustment program with the IMF, and it was relatively successful. It's interesting that basically they were able to do everything they could do by decree, but none of the government of the time, Carlos Andrés Pérez, had his own party completely against him. So there were no reforms. There were tax reforms that they wanted to do, labor reforms. None of them were approved. Nothing structural really happened. Now to finish this idea of what may explain some of these run-up episodes, I just follow the sort of the accounting exercise. And here I just want you to focus on kind of the average to take the first cut at this. So these are the sources that you can decompose the budget, kind of the internal debt, external, money issued or the seniorage, and then the obligations, which are the gross payments of internal debt, external debt, primary deficit, or the transfers. And as you see, in terms of the obligation, the primary deficits are really not, in average, they haven't been a huge problem, but these transfers, which in here I'm calculating them as a residual. I think one plan would be to kind of disaggregate that and account for them. Now, then in the sources, seniorage is kind of, at least for the average, it seems what accounts for most of the source of government revenues. But if you look at this period that I emphasized after the 75 to 86, which is you had the big oil shock in 74, but then the subsequent oil shocks in the 80s. And you see that external debt was the highest source of that. There was Venezuela never defaulted. There was a stop of payment. There was a suspension of payments, 89. Right, but this was part of the adjustment with the IMF. So no default, zero haircut. There was a restructuring of the debt. So they got credits that was much better in terms of longer term, better interest rates, but there was no default. That's interesting. I think we may be in the first episode where we may see perhaps hyperinflation and default happening. But I guess so. In these experiences, redemption did came. So just to finalize, I wanted to touch on the comment that Fernando made that these episodes all look very depressive, and I think it's something that related to what Tim was talking about Europe is that one thing that is really limiting for these economies, and I think moving forward, is that they are not doing well in terms of productivity. So if you take out all those swings in the short-term growth that we tend to see in these economies, so if you kind of smooth that out and look at the secular trend in kind of productivity, most of these economies don't look very good. So this is relative to the United States, where the U.S. economy is growing above 2%. There's very few economies that just keep up with that. Brazil, Chile. I guess Chile is now growing faster than that, but the performance is really bad. And I think to some extent, this is important to keep in mind in terms of how this is going to affect future payments. Okay.
So are they still doing this thing with the sort of like Friedman money rule type of thing? No way.
No, nothing.
But how long do they? So they had like 7 years like announcing this year we're gonna print 5%. Well, not 5, probably we're printing 50.
Monetary program. At the beginning of each year.
And interest rate will go up and down like this.
Exactly, likely.
And they'll just say, we'll just.
Yeah, it was a period when the interbank markets were not really developed yet, but it was slowly developing until, and also the relationship between money and inflation broke down in the 90s, 1960, documented in 1996 or something, and slowly the central bank changed it to control more than later, in 2000 started with interest
But this is like roughly 7 years of announcing money growth.
Even more. Until 2000, we are announcing money growth rates.
One comment, you don't mention much about dollarization, but Peru dollarized and still pretty heavily dollarized, but I didn't see much discussion about it in the presentation. I don't know what the implications are, but I mean, it's an important characteristic of.
But when you say that they print, say, 20%, what do they do with the money? I mean, I'm thinking like so much like over market operations, but these guys, what they say they didn't have really bonds. What do they do? They just really helicopter drop type. They give it to the public firms. It'd be good to discuss this.
Yep.
I mean, that's my whatever something.
To discuss in the.
It's kind of different from the U.S. and Europe. People were used to think of that, and this seems to be kind of.
There can only be two sources: open market operations, use government debt, or open market operation, or basically loans to the banking sector.
Loans to the banking sector. Loans to the banking sector.
So again,
are these transfers to the central government?
No.
No. No, in the 90s.
yeah, after the.
So suppose when you print 40%, it is
Of money.
92. So those 40% are like transfers to the central government.
Loans to the banks. Loans to banks.
So
But they're not buying securities on the open market.
Open
It's just
market.
people-
They
oh, they are.
Banking was already reformed, so we couldn't do lending directly to
Yes.
the public sector, so it had to go through the banking.
Forbidden.
The open market
But they have
operation
already
that-
like a market in which you could buy and sell securities. And maybe they could be like loans.
It was a really rudimentary interbank operations in the 90s. Very rudimentary. They started. And the securities at the beginning were, until now, central bank securities. So open market operations are not with T-bills because they are dangerous. We can mess up. It is central bank securities until 1 year maturity.
So this is basically like I don't know. So I thought that the central bank buys something has to be issued by someone else. This is like saying the central banks buy something that was issued by the central bank.
Yes, swap of assets.
No, the same guy. It had to be someone else. Anyway, it's a good thing to explain it.
We'll go to one detail.
It's like how it goes.
All central banks issue paper and buy.
I know, but in net, if you are increasing, say, 20%, you have to trade with
Every
someone
year,
else.
yep.
Yeah, of course.
Somebody is
Trade with
Yeah, you need to swap and 5% you don't.
The issue that when you sell a central bank paper, you are just or do the reverse. You are managing liquidity.
So I guess the idea is that there is a stock of debt that instead of being debt of the treasury, is debt of the central bank. And then you could increase this debt, or so if we should think about like the central bank and treasury together and then changing this stock.
They're probably doing repo. Are they doing repo operations?
Yes, of course. The thing is that all started slowly, slowly, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. At the beginning, there was no many instruments.
Another way potentially is exchange rate also. So
Oh, yeah. Another open market
buying dollars.
But they're not fixed exchange rates, so they
They're
could
not
just do like a little bit.
They're not.
Okay.
Cosas del capital.
Thank you very much to everyone for coming. And I think we learned a lot from this. And
Nice update we're going to make, and you'll be hearing from us soon.
Here for the guys.
Thank you.